started. Just before we dive into the nitty-gritty, I thought I'd share a little bit about myself, so people will know where I come from and kind of my journey, professional journey that's led me to where I am today. I've primarily worked within the FinTech or financial services and technology industry for the majority of my career. And it's something that I'm very, very passionate about and something that I genuinely love doing. I love working at the intersection of financial services and tech, particularly exploring ways in how financial inclusion can essentially change lives and how it can, bring uncomfortable conversations to the forefront and get people to focus on more intimate areas of their lives they kind of not like to talk about. So that's something that I'm really passionate about. I got my start by accident in this gigantic industry. I first started out with a small company that I'm sure not many people have heard of called the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units. And that was only because I was in grad school, got put in a capstone project that dealt with anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. And I was hooked from then on. I just really loved diving into the nitty-gritty of regulatory compliance frameworks and trying to figure out why, certain nations were so far ahead compared to others. And that's essentially when I started kind of wandering into the financial services industry, when I looked at virtual currencies and Bitcoin. And this was back in 2014 when it was a completely new concept. People were super sketched out by it. So one of the first things I did was look at policy recommendations for global regulatory compliance networks and how you can actually deal with virtual currencies. And that's kind of where things started kicking off. I started talking to thought leaders within the space, got in touch with a few folks who had just started up a small company in Vancouver called the Digital Finance Institute. And they kind of put me in touch with more people. And that's really my first, I'd say, big foray into the UX world, was with the Digital Finance Institute, where I started conducting customer interviews, user tests, started building prototypes, conducted heuristic analysis. And this is for dealing with products in multiple sectors. So think AI, think blockchain, think digital identity. It was kind of all over the place. And that was really kind of what hooked me onto FinTech. And at the same time, because at that point, 2015 to 2016, FinTech was this kind of weird portmanteau that no one really knew how to explain. It wasn't something that was widely accepted. People were still kind of wary. So working with the Digital Finance Institute wasn't exactly paying the bills at the same time. So I wanted to definitely branch out and get a steady paycheck in, which is why I started working at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce in Toronto, Canada. And I was essentially their lead programs officer, working with small and medium-sized companies and helping them develop and shore up their export programs and kind of pursue economic diversification. And then came my big foray into consulting. That's kind of where I spent the bulk of my career. I was a consultant at McKinsey and Company. I was within their client engagement division. I worked here primarily in a very research and strategy development side of things, working with wealth management firms, working with financial advisors, really scoping out what were some of the issues they were dealing with, if they were pursuing things like organic growth, how they can essentially beef up their books of business, and working with clients within the wealth management and the wealth tech space. I also worked at the small startup called the FinTech Growth Syndicate, and that was an incredible time here in Canada because I got to work with some of the largest payment services providers based in Canada. And I really kind of fell in love with this whole idea of conducting research, conducting deep dives into various sectors of the FinTech industry, figuring out, what's going on there, conducting competitive analysis, talking to users, figuring out their pain points, and then kind of synthesizing all of that and figuring out a way to kind of shore up a company or some of our clients' innovation portfolios. And you'll see a little bit more about that as I proceed with my talk. Most recently, I joined this company called Credit Sesame a little over a year ago. And this is kind of the first company that I joined that didn't already have an established research function in place whatsoever. they had been a very product-focused organization, and there was very little emphasis on the customer. So when I did come across this role, one of the things that really intrigued me was the fact that this was a company that had existed, somehow managed to exist close to a decade, and still thrive, still be a dominant leader in, the credit scoring business, but at the same time not have an established UX research practice in place. They had a researcher, I believe, but she was kind of pulled in different directions. So they really wanted to transform this company from a product-focused company to more of a customer-focused company. And that was a great challenge for me. I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to essentially build a research and strategy practice from the ground up, set a solid foundation and help champion and drive that very user-centric culture throughout the organization. And it's not come easy. There's definitely been a lot of challenges along the way, but I've learned or picked up an enormous amount of wisdom along the way as well. So I'm excited to share some of that with you today. And you can't tell by looking at some of these logos, but I've worked in companies that have, essentially welcomed the UX discipline with open arms and said, hey, come in, we're absolutely willing to have you as a collaborator. Please here's your seat at the table. But I've also worked at companies where UX, the discipline was kind of used as window dressing, and people kind of like to say they did UX research or followed user-centric principles, but they really did none of that. And it was just more of a check off the box kind of thing. So a lot of the takeaways that I have today in this deck are essentially I try to keep them as high level and generic as possible. So I want people to kind of customize them and take bits and pieces here and there that you feel would best work for your strategy, best work for the culture that you're in and the environment that you're in, and go from there. So that's a little bit about me on the professional front. I do have a life outside of work. So here's just a little bit about me outside of that. I am a Krav Maga practitioner. For those who don't know, Krav Maga is an Israeli martial arts. I got involved in it about 4 years ago, and it's definitely one of the disciplines that's definitely changed the way I think about life, changed the way I function at work, and that's something that I've really enjoyed doing. It's also a great stress reliever to kind of go out and kick some butt. So highly recommend finding a Krav Maga place wherever you're located, at least trying out a class. It's always great to know how to defend yourself. Another thing about me is I'm a certified dive master. I love scuba diving. One of my absolute passions is kind of just taking time off, going off the grid for at least a week once a year, and just going scuba diving. I just love the whole idea of being underwater and feeling incredibly minuscule and tiny. It's a wonderful and humbling experience and very, very peaceful. So that's something I would recommend you try as well. And last little fun fact about me is I am terrified of dogs. Here's a picture of Courage the Cowardly Dog. And this is something that's kind of plagued me from childhood. So it's something I'm also actively trying to get over, but I'm also really grateful that we're now past that point of work from home where I have to say hi to everyone's dogs on Zoom. So I'm really glad we're like past that and the novelty has worn off. So there you go. All right, so now let's sort of dive into the nitty gritty of things. Like Chris mentioned, we've kind of broken up this talk into 2 sections. So the first one, we'll talk a little bit about empathizing with users, what it means to actually create a comfort zone with your user or for your user, so you can actually set them up or get them set up in the best position to provide you with meaningful insight and meaningful feedback. We'll also talk a little bit about what an iterative UX process looks like within an organization, whether you're starting from scratch, it's already in place. Some of the key pieces of knowledge that I've used during my time over the past 8 years, something that you can also leverage. I also want to talk a little bit about the value add that a robust user research program can add for you or for your company. You'll soon find out that it's not just about creating a better product or service. It can do so many more things if leveraged correctly, and that's something that you can definitely advocate for. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about how, building on, the robust user research, how you can actually leverage it to build long-term innovation portfolios, just using your UX teams in place. So you're not just there to conduct research, you're not just here to be a UX writer or a designer, or even a UX unicorn. That's the latest job title I've heard. You can do so much more for your company. That's the first section. And after that, we'll take a little bit of a break and, get some conversation going. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have, happy to address any comments as well. And finally, the second half of this meetup will focus on championing that user-driven culture, what it really takes to, be an advocate for your users, what it takes to build credibility with your peers, and what it basically takes to get the organization on your side so you feel like you're working with them and it's not constantly an uphill battle. And we'll talk a little bit more about building a solid repository, how you can win over stubborn stakeholders, because I'm sure we've all worked with them or will all work with them in the future. And finally, we'll talk a little bit more about inviting other folks to the table. It shouldn't only be your job to partake in a UX related discipline. You should be welcoming other people to the table as well. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about defining success and what that looks like for your team, for yourself, and for the company that you work with as well. Okay, so let's get started. When empathizing with users and advocating for them, it's very important to meet people in their headspace and not kind of come to the table with a predetermined set of ideas and you're trying to get them to kind of fit a square peg in a round hole, and you're trying to retrofit them into your idea of what's right and what's wrong. So talking a little bit more about an iterative and rewarding process that the UX can be, and I want to shout out Chris Centers again for this particular slide. He created a version of this slide for one of our company meetings. It unfortunately never got to see the light of day, so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. As you can see in the graphic in the middle here, it's UX research in particular is never really a linear process. It's very convoluted, it's messy, it often involves going back to the table, starting from square one, and that's okay. Some of the methods that we've used, that I've used in the past and we currently use at Credit Sesame are, doing like really deep competitive analysis. We want to see how we're benchmarked against our competitors. We want to kind of stay constantly aware about things that may be happening within our space that we're not aware of. We also like to conduct concept research and do a little roadmap planning for the future, because it's not only important that we're ahead of our game where we're at right now, but what else do we have out there in the future that maybe hasn't been brought up yet, maybe hasn't been tested? What are some things that we can do with that as well? We conduct a lot of usability tests, both moderated and unmoderated. We're churning out prototypes almost, I'd say, every other day or so to be tested in some cases. We conduct surveys with our customers. We also do a lot of qualitative research, and this comes in very handy, especially if you're within a similar industry, such as like the financial services industry, because oftentimes you'll see that a lot of the UX research methods that you use can't really get at the heart of the problem until you actually talk to the customer or until you actually talk to your end user. And since it's about a very intimate and private area of their lives, you don't really understand their problems that they're trying to address, the jobs they're trying to get done, unless you actually talk to them and really meet them in their headspace and find out where they're coming from. And finally, we're a small team. Chris Centers is actually one of the first people that we hired for the team. So it takes a lot of work to build a team. And it's important that this team doesn't work in isolation. You also have to make sure that whatever research or whatever thing you're doing, you're constantly synthesizing, you're constantly sharing, but you're also asking for feedback along the way. You'll see in the graphic here, it's never a straight line. You're always kind of going back to the drawing board as well. And you'll see in the course of the presentation that that's something that should be welcomed. It shouldn't be kind of thought of as an exhausting approach, or it feels like you're kind of going around in circles. If you aren't going around in circles, then you're probably doing something wrong in the first place. And finally, these are some of the sample deliverables that I've worked with in the past. It's obviously not an exhaustive list, but we come up with things like insight reports, customer journey maps. Recently, we held an offsite about, again, kind of trying to champion the user-driven culture within Credit Sesame, trying to find out the jobs to be done of certain segments of our customers. And that's something, kind of workshops like that, especially they're conducted with other teams and not just in isolation, you'll see ends up being a lot more rewarding and more knowledgeable than if you were to just kind of go and do it with your team on a whiteboard by yourself. One of the goals that we're really focused on, the UX research should focus on, is really uncovering latent needs. What are some things that you think your customer needs? Make a list of that. And when you figure it, and when you actually go and talk to customers, you'll be surprised how very little or a very small percentage of that you actually got correct. Especially in the financial services space, I find that, I will say it up front, that I come from a very privileged position. A lot of times there is this misnomer that customers, especially within the financial services space that use apps, have made bad decisions. That's not true. The thing is, at the end of the day, I'm privileged enough to say that I didn't make good choices. I had access to good choices and I maximized them. And the goal is that something that you should also want for your user is to be able to provide them with good choices so they can have their pick instead of them settling for a choice that may not be their ideal one. A couple of other things I've also done is build segments of our customers, build personas. And you'll see later on in the talk that if you do this right, especially your segmentation and persona right, you can kind of uncover a treasure trove of data that you never thought you had. Not just quantitative data, but a lot of qualitative data that, if leveraged correctly, can kind of really just transform your business. So that's important that you get it right. And it doesn't have to be something that you get right on the first attempt. It can be, again, a very iterative process, but just be open to feedback, be open to constantly learning. You might be, for example, the UX research or the design or like the UX writer expert on your team, but definitely don't get territorial about your role. Definitely be open to exploring other facets of your role that you may not have figured you wanted to explore or may not wanted to leverage. You'll kind of figure out that you're kind of discovering your own talents as you do that. And finally, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, one of the things you can actually do with UX research in particular is really help that inform your messaging and communication strategy. As I mentioned earlier on, it isn't just about building a good product or a good service. It's also about how you can communicate the value proposition of the product and service that you're building. All right, let's go kind of pick up where we left off in terms of, robust user research doing more than just building that better product and service. Here are some of the things that, if leveraged correctly, user research can do for you. You get to actually tailor your experience by user state. If you can figure out, for example, where your current users are, are they enrolled in the product or service? Are they hesitant? Do they have one foot out the door? Are they apprehensive? You can really customize your experience to meet users in their particular headspace. So it doesn't kind of have to be a one-size-fits-all approach. It can be something that's very customizable to the user based on the funnel, the portion of the funnel they're in. Another thing you can do is, this is something that one of the reasons that I've definitely emphasized the importance of qualitative research, especially at the company that I'm at right now, is building that emotional connection with users. You need to kind of be at that point where you empathize with them, where you're feeling what they're feeling, and you can actually build a stronger connection with them, in terms of building your brand. As you'll see soon, you can incorporate visuals that really speak to them, whether it's like the kind of lifestyle, like sort of hero images, lifestyle images that they wish they had, or products they wish to have access to. You can kind of put that on display. You can really craft your messaging to really match the mindset and intent for your users. And as I was saying, brand positioning as well. Talking to users, conducting research really helps hone in and identify your brand positioning, brand proposition. Are you maybe too optimistic right now for your user base? Are you too pessimistic? Really kind of helps you kind of set yourself on the spectrum and figure out how you want to communicate what your brand does. How do you, at the end of the day, how do you want to make your users feel when they come to you? Do you want them to feel like, you've got all the solutions to all their problems? Do you want to make them feel empowered? That's totally up to you. And you can actually, in a way, dictate the state of mind that you would like them to be in if you do your research correctly. A couple other things you can do is focusing on your value props. One of the things that we do really well at Credit Sesame is we're constantly testing, we're constantly running experiments to see what's working, what's not. We're a huge fan of A/B testing, figuring out key value prop combinations for each user state to kind of get a better understanding of, which kind of benefits drive different behaviors, which cohorts seem to perform better. That's something that can all be leveraged if you are that advocate for user research. You can also layer on behavioral economics tactics. Again, totally dependent on the space you operate in. But some of the things that I found is figuring out how to test tactics on websites or apps or different channels that our users come through during key points in the enrollment funnel. So, we can use things like anchoring to figure out what's kind of getting their foot in the door, and then saying, okay, this is what's getting their foot in the door. Here's how we actually continue to keep them. Zero risk bias, framing. There's all kinds of things you can use behavioral economics for. And that's something that you can use that to really influence the way you conduct user research as well. And finally, you can expand your brand presence in meaningful ways. Prior to the research and strategy function being established in Credit Sesame, we were kind of a very one-trick pony, if you will, where we really only had our brand presence on YouTube and I think a little bit of Facebook. But since then, when we've learned more about our customers, learned more about our users, we've been able to expand our brand presence into other channels like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, figuring out how we can combine the best practices of each of this channel and user research to really hone strategic direction. Our users who frequent TikTok speak a different language than people who visit Facebook, for example. So we're kind of able to really figure out what's the best way to meet them in their headspace. Finally, one of the other things that we can do is invest in a long-term UX strategy. What I like to do when I'm kind of building out an innovation portfolio is kind of bucket them into 3 different tracks. So core, as in what can we do right now to optimize existing products for existing users? And think of the mandate for the core function being to execute on current offerings. And the key driver here would be what can we do to close that performance gap? The next sort of bucket to think of is an adjacent strategy. It's like, what can we do to expand your current business to entirely new company business? And I apologize for the typo here. So the key here is to, expand with new products, new markets, and new users. So you can really experiment here. And finally, the driver here is to take advantage of an identifiable opportunity gap in the mix. This is something that you may not have thought was possible. No one else has exploited. This is something where you can kind of plant your flag and really make a mark for yourself. And finally, it's the disruptive portion where it's something, think of it as Horizon 3, like really far out. It's not something you're focused on right now, but how can you develop breakthroughs and invent products for markets that don't exist yet? And the mandate here is just experiment, because you kind of treat this as the world is your oyster and go from there. And finally, the goal here is to invent your own opportunity gap. You're not kind of going by what the market's telling you. You're not really going by what the key thing in the industry is at the moment. You're kind of inventing it as you go along. And UX research in particular can kind of help you at every single stage. You just have to set the foundation for it, continue to be an advocate for it, and also drive this innovation throughout the company. And I will say that it's something that does take a lot of work. It does take a lot of resilience and patience, as you'll see. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, but it's incredibly rewarding. It's an incredibly rewarding experience that can really transform the way you operate within the company, but also the way the company operates within their industry as well, if leveraged correctly. And finally, little malfunction there. And finally, in terms of setting up a comfort zone for your user, one of the key things that I tell people when conducting user research is it's key to actually select the best cohort of users you want to talk to. I think there's this idea that we have to talk to as many customers as possible just to get an idea. Let's just go for it. And the thing is, if you use that strategy, you will end up drinking from a fire hose. You're going to be inundated with a bunch of research, with a bunch of data that you don't really know what to do with or how to capitalize on. But it's important to really select and narrow down the best cohort you actually want to talk to. What problem are you trying to solve? Are you trying to, for example, solve for why a customer is dropping off at a certain point in the funnel? Or are you trying to solve for, what's the biggest kind of obstacle to getting them in the door? A great example of this is I worked on a product recently called Credit Builder that's actually launching midnight tonight, I believe. And one of the key things was cohort selection. We can't just talk to every person that wants to build our credit. That's kind of going to be futile. We kind of had to narrow that down to, for example, users who were just trying to get their foot in the door in the credit space, people who were just signing up for things like secured cards because they weren't accepted anywhere else. Once you kind of narrow the cohort you want to actually target, you just end up with a lot more data that you can kind of ladder up to and then talk to more users as you go from there. Second point is being empathetic and neutral at the same point. Especially working in the financial services industry, you tend to come across people who are struggling and who kind of want to kind of go on a little rant and talk about how unfair, the odds are stacked against them. And that's completely fine. The goal here is when you're talking to your users is to not constantly validate everything they say, but kind of be empathetic, be listening, but listen to them, listen to what they have to say, offer them a shoulder to cry on if needed, but at the same time, remain neutral. And that's something that I know recently what I've done is encouraged other people like product managers and designers to talk to users as well. And this is something that they say they struggle with is because they just don't know how to react when someone is, kind of telling them their life story and talking to them about financial hardships and things like that. The goal is, yes, listen to them, offer them comforting words, but at the same time, remain neutral. And you'll find this a lot when you're talking to users is oftentimes you'll really talk about, when you're talking about intimate and personal areas of their lives, they tend to respond in very monosyllabic answers or monosyllabic tones, and you kind of are just left not knowing what to say next. There's always ways to kind of dig deeper. So if someone is just like, yep, nope, what I like to do is you felt a certain way about X product. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or is there any particular reason you feel that way? And that kind of warms them up a little more, and then they kind of get the ball rolling. It's also important here is to avoid making fuzzy leaps of faith. Oftentimes when I'm coaching other people to talk to users and talk to customers, one of the things I tell them to avoid doing is making bold statements like, okay, so if we offer X feature, you're likely to sign up for it, correct? Now it's very leading, and most people are likely to say yes to that because who wouldn't want to, sign up for that feature if it meant a benefit to them personally. So it's important to kind of avoid leading questions and avoid basing your next steps on what the answer to that is, especially if you phrase the question in that particular way, because that's just going to skew a lot of your data. And it's also going to skew the way you end up approaching research in the first place, because you've kind of already tainted their experience for them. And the last thing is really avoiding conversational roadblocks. And what I mean by that is oftentimes you will find that people that you talk to, your end users that you talk to are very comfortable with silence. They don't really care. They're probably just in it for the gift card they're going to get at the end of the day, or just a little bit of insight they get, but they're not willing to be as open. So it's really important to let people know upfront that any feedback is good feedback. It doesn't necessarily have to be positive. It doesn't necessarily have to be only negative. It can be anything they wish to share, even if it doesn't directly relate to the service they're using. Maybe something happened in their day, or something happened in their other outside financial life that affected the way that they think or view your product or your service. So it's kind of important to kind of set the tone up front and let them know that, hey, I have a set agenda for the way this call or way this focus group or way this interview is going to go. But if we do get off task, if we do get derailed a bit, that's fine. Happy to see where that takes us, but I will bring us back onto track. So when you do come across tricky silences or people kind of going off tangent, it's easy to sort of bring them back as long as you kind of let them know what they're in for up front. That's these are just some tips that I've gained from my experience setting up a function and coaching other people to kind of take this on in terms of really creating that comfort zone for your user and making sure that they're set up and they're not just comfortable, but they feel empowered in their position to share their feedback and share their insights with you. And that's something that you can leverage to essentially not only turn their life around, but potentially turn other people's lives around as well. And I often feel that that's something that helps people get into the right mindset of sharing feedback as well when they know that it could potentially affect other people's lives as well. All right. So that's sort of the end where we are. And I wanted to leave this little comic up here. But before we dive right into the second section, I want to take a pause right here for a bit and see if anyone has any comments or questions.
Hi, I was just curious, how did you find your users or I guess collect them? Do you send out like emails when you are looking for them? Because it did seem like such a very specific and narrow group that you guys started testing for with the end users.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really depended on the project that we were in. I will say that I'm very lucky that I'm working for a company that has millions of users and has ways to actually contact them. Some of the ways we've contacted them is essentially putting up a little pop-up survey on our Web Engage tool. So if users came onto our website, there was a little survey that said, would you be interested in like a 15-minute or 30-minute chat at the end of a couple of screening questions? And, please leave your email address here. And that's how we contacted them. That's probably the most direct way and the most, I want to say, rewarding way, because people know what they're signing up for. So they're actually more likely to, for example, pick up the phone when you actually call them because they're like, okay, I signed up for this one thing. Another method that we've used in the past with less success is contacting them blind. And what that means is we would essentially go to our data team and give them the specific parameters and say, can you please, for example, find us users with credit scores under 550 who have, these many lines of credit that were open. Can you please give us their user tokens and their email IDs? And we kind of cold email them and say, hey, you were randomly selected. Can you please, or if you're interested, are you able to participate in this? That's definitely, like I mentioned, less successful. And that's only because we're catching people unaware. And as I mentioned, we're talking about things like personal finances and credit scoring and, how their access to or lack of access to credit has affected their lives. And people are more reticent and less likely to share their experience. So I've always definitely pushed for letting people know upfront what they're signing up for, and only if they're willing, they'd actually participate in the phone calls with us.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. I hadn't thought of the first one, but I like that, definitely. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, for sure. And one last thing I'd like to add is if that's a tool you have available at your disposal, something that we do is we only kind of advertise on our web platform. We found that our app users or in-app users are often more active. So we've gotten a lot more traction there. So if you are kind of able to, deploy surveys and things like that on two platforms, definitely recommend it. And you'll definitely have to see which one is more active than the other. But the wider you cast your net, the better your chances are.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
When you were going over the long-term strategy with the core, adjacent, and disruptive sort of efforts that you can make, how do you balance those with like a smaller UX research team? Like, how do you prioritize that? And does it change over time where the emphasis should be?
Yeah, absolutely. With a smaller UX team, I found, especially in my previous roles, that really your bandwidth only allows you to focus on core at the moment. And that's only because of a resourcing issue. In terms of the core, adjacent, disruptive, I would say think of it more as a horizon, 3-horizon timeline. So what can you do right now? Core is something you can achieve, I want to say, depending on capabilities and resourcing, of course, within the next 3 to 6 months, maybe extend that to a year. Adjacent is something I want to say in the next 2 to 3 years, a couple of years. And disruptive, just given the fact that you're looking, for example, products that don't exist for markets that may not exist yet, that's something more of like a 5-year strategy, 5+ year strategy, maybe something over the course of a decade that you can actually pursue. The reason I brought that up in here in this talk is because I want people to start thinking about laying the foundations for all of this as it goes, because you're not only here. Ideally, hopefully you will all do the kind of work that you kind of want to leave a legacy behind, and you kind of, even if you no longer work at a company, for example, you want to set up your successors for the best chance of success. So even if you take part in the core strategy right now, you leave, you want your UX research and UX strategy practice to have the resources and capabilities to carry on the adjacent and carry on the disruptive, even if you're no longer there.
Thank you.
All right, so in case the print is too small, I'll do a quick readout of this Dilbert comic. But the first panel says, we interviewed hundreds of users and turned all of their suggestions into features. As it turns out, every user we talked to was an idiot, and their dumb suggestions ruined our product. And then finally, in hindsight, we probably should have just talked to people who work outside this building. This scenario is more common than you think, where you'll find that if people come across outputs of UX research, if they kind of don't fit your agenda or they don't fit the mental map you have in your mind, then it's kind of not useful at all. It's to be discarded and never thought of again. Well, I'm here to tell you that you can actually use the research and the insights that may not kind of provide immediate value. You can kind of use them as lessons that the teachable moments, if you will, and lessons to share with your stakeholders and coworkers as well. So let's dive right into it. So a little bit of what we're about to dive into right now is how you can actually bring people on board Team UX. As I mentioned earlier on, this shouldn't be kind of a solitary effort. This should definitely be a collaborative effort. And here I want to say 5 key strategies, and we'll talk a little bit more about the tactics that fall under each strategy as we go through the deck. But key things to remember is really documenting every single recommendation or every key insight you end up uncovering. Make sure you document it, not just for right now, but for future use itself. Figure out how you can democratize the UX process itself. As I mentioned, it's important to bring other people to the table and not kind of conduct all your practice in solitary confinement. I'll share a little bit more about how you can actually make your users more relatable. Oftentimes, if you're the only one, for example, doing UX research and you're conveying the insights to another person, they're not really hearing it from the horse's mouth. So chances are things can kind of get diluted along the way. People don't really take you seriously. So I'll share a few strategies on how you can actually make your users relatable and a couple of anecdotes that ended up working really well for me. Other things we'll talk about are how you can actually set guidelines for success and define success on your own terms, not just for yourself, but for your team as well. No matter how small or no matter how large it is, it's important to really kind of know what you're getting into. And finally, something that I think everyone has encountered or you may encounter in the future is how you can work with stubborn stakeholders who may not see the value in UX or may see it but don't really want to go too into the weeds because it's too cumbersome for them. I'll show you a couple of different strategies you can use to actually bring those people on board Team UX. So first things first is kind of building a solid foundation for storing your research. This is something that I had to learn how to essentially do and create this process for Credit Sesame when I joined. They had absolutely no repository whatsoever. Any research whatsoever that was conducted was kind of floating and kind of living in people's Slack channels and people's drives. There was really no centralized location where if I had a project or a problem I needed to solve and wanted to know what had already been done, I was kind of, left to my own devices and trying to figure out who to message to see who might have enough institutional knowledge to point me in the right direction. So whether you're just getting started or whether you're kind of already halfway there, or you're already in an established place, it's still important to make sure that you're kind of doing your bit to really build a solid foundation for storing your research and making that accessible to everyone. What I mean in terms of creating a robust repository. It's something you can reference when you run out of inspiration. So it's not only just something that you can make accessible, but say you're kind of you're juggling multiple projects, you're kind of, having to do a lot of context switching. It's important that you can create that reference library or the repository, if you will, if you're kind of having a down and out day, not really sure if things are kind of stale, things are not moving. You can kind of reference when you run out of inspiration and say, maybe 2 months ago, this idea or this recommendation may not have worked, but now the time may be more ripe. You might have brought more stakeholders over to your side. The designers or the devs, for example, may have more bandwidth on their plate to be able to tackle this. So it's good to kind of know, have, I guess, an archive of things that you can always pull from. And also it's important to, again, not kind of hoard this archive, is to always make this accessible to cross-functional teams, depending on who you work with or who your key stakeholders are. And you'll see later on, this will also help empower them to conduct their own research. They can kind of see how things were done in the past, look at best practices and look at how best to follow along, how to synthesize research. And this will definitely kind of help also coach and teach them what to do. A couple of different things you can do, no matter how minute the recommendation is. For example, even if it's something as simple as, change the color of the CTA or move the CTA 2 inches above, capture every single recommendation you make. And what I recommend doing is actually creating a spreadsheet and tracking the status of every single recommendation you make. For example, in this case, I was working on the product called Credit Builder. Over the course of 11 months, I've documented every single recommendation I've made. I've kind of divided it by screen that the product was focused on, by owner, by date, by status, and by outcome. And you'll see on the right-hand side, this spider chart out there. This is important, when you create a spreadsheet like this, it doesn't only serve as a, haha, I told you so when things go bust and, they never listen to you, but you can also look at, like, a couple of months down the line, track where things were and figure out how it went. A couple of different status and outcomes I like to track by, and this is obviously customizable depending on your line of work. I did complete, what was ongoing, what was future, what was something that was completely out of scope, so don't even think about it, and what was deprioritized right now, but can maybe pick up in the near term. And obviously, when you have a spreadsheet like this, no one wants to go through like a treasure trove of data like that. It's kind of very boring to look at. What I found was more compelling was kind of making a visualization of all the things that I've done. And here is a visualization of a spider chart with dummy data that I put in. But I essentially tracked the evolution of our Credit Builder product through the 3 different phases that it went through. So pre-alpha, the little yellow slash right there. You'll see there were more deprioritized and they were complete. Alpha was, probably our least successful phase in the sense that very few recommendations were complete. But then finally, beta was the one where we've had the most success, where, we've been able to get a lot of stakeholders on board to actually listen to most of our recommendations. So at a quick glance, if somebody wanted a really high level overview of where things were at with a certain project, you can obviously change the different visualization formats, but at a high level, this definitely serves to tell a story in terms of your evolution as well. And this can also serve as a lesson to see what went right or what went wrong in each of these phases, for example. So maybe if I could go down and figure out what I did right with the beta phase that got people to accept more of my recommendations versus what I did wrong in, say, like the alpha phase, I can also learn from it and then make sure I incorporate those learnings into my next round of research.
Just wondering here, actually, on that chart, just speaking tactically, is there a reason why this should be done in like a separate spreadsheet as opposed to having maybe your own space in like a Jira board where you have sort of UX research type of questions? I'm just wondering, like, in your experience, like in terms of how like everyone can have visibility. I wonder if there would be, say, like an icebox part of Jira where it's like, oh, here are questions of various horizons that the UX research team's looking at, like, and these are things that maybe eventually will drag onto the board, versus you having like your own separate like actual spreadsheet,
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fair question. So the only reason that I did it on spreadsheet was just the way our teams work internally. Jira is often reserved for more of the technical folks. So think of like the devs, the engineers. They're the only ones really accessing it. So if I were to, for example, I'm thinking of my audience. If I wanted to send this spreadsheet, if I wanted to send this research or this snapshot to say a PM or an exec, they're not going to open up a Jira board at all. I just know their behavior. They're more likely to access like a Google Sheets or a spreadsheet or like a quick PowerPoint deck. So figure out the best, I guess, channel that you can use to communicate. If Jira is something that a tool that all the people in your organization, everyone's familiar with, that's something that works. If spreadsheets are something like the name of the game, use that as well. And definitely make it in a way that's transferable. We also tend to use Kanban boards during some of our team meetings. So you can also translate or transfer, I should say, some of this insights, some of these snapshots onto there as well. Again, it's totally up to you what method you want to use.
Okay.
All right. So the next portion is talking a little bit more about building a larger table, not a taller wall, and figuring out ways to invite your non-UX colleagues to the table and make them feel like they're part of the process as well. And this is something that's important when it comes to really building that credibility and making people feel like they have a voice at the table. Couple of things you can do. The first thing is build a case for the others' involvement. Let them know what did they stand to gain, especially if you're working at a company or you're working for someone that has a very siloed practice in place where there's really not much interaction between, say, for example, a UX researcher and a designer, or a researcher and a PM for something, or PM, for example. Sit down and let the other person that you want to be at the table, let them know, like, what did they stand to gain? For example, what I've done in the past is when I talk to designers, and I work with designers, I actively advocate for designers to conduct their own user tests, for example, because their knowledge that they bring to the table is vastly different from what I bring to the table. My line of questioning will be quite different from what they want to gain from a prototype, for example. So the way I approach it is say, here's what you can gain. Like, this can also help you become a better designer at the end of the day. Here's what you stand to gain from actually participating in this process and not kind of relying on feedback that I give you or highlight reels that I show you. Another thing which is kind of interesting is when you start inviting people to a table, it's essential to establish guidelines and boundaries and have that clear division of work, saying, here's what we can offer, here's what my team can offer versus what you can offer. And this is really important, especially if you work in very territorial organizations where people don't like to encroach or don't like to join others at the table. They're more, let me do my work, just do yours, and we'll collaborate when necessary. So it's important if people do feel a little threatened, if you start to kind of invite them into your bubble, or if you feel threatened that you might kind of be deemed redundant, please don't feel that way. This is definitely going to help make your life a lot easier. Definitely helps establishing guidelines and boundaries at the start so people know what they're getting into. This is really important in terms of conducting training sessions. When you're inviting non-UX people to the table, it's important that they know how to behave or how to interact with the user, especially if they're conducting user research sessions or focus groups or user tests. They're starting from scratch. So think about when you first ventured into the discipline. How much did you know? Did someone hold your hand? Were you kind of just thrown into the deep end? Think of them as being that person you were a few years ago or a few months ago or whatever. How would you, what kind of resource or what kind of help would you have liked? So sit them down, conduct training sessions, be willing to be a mentor, and also impart your knowledge. And as I said, it'll make your life a lot easier if people know what they're doing, as opposed to people constantly coming to you and asking for help or asking to verify things. It'll really help if you empower them and let them know that, they can come to you if there's questions, but they should also feel confident enough in their own capabilities, for example, to conduct UX research. Here's something to do if people just aren't willing to join you at the table, or they're maybe a little apprehensive or a little shy to, kind of foray into a domain that's really not that's not within their expertise. Invite silent observers to your research sessions. And we've done this a lot at all of my companies, where people, for example, people on the data team who may not be as savvy with talking to users, may not have been as comfortable with words and languages and things like that. We just said, hey, if your platform or if your testing session allows for it, just sit in silence, kind of observe, see how I conduct a session, for example, take notes along the way and see if that's something that you feel confident and comfortable enough in replicating on your own. And that's something that people have said that is definitely useful, just kind of having someone walk through it, watching someone walk through it the first time, so they can actually pick up little tips and pointers on their own, and they can feel empowered to hopefully next time do this on their own without you being there. And finally, this is important. I mentioned earlier on, don't get too territorial, be welcoming enough to invite other people to the table, but also know when there may be too many cooks in the kitchen. The last thing you want is invite every single person to the table for like a UX research session, and then nothing gets done because there's too many competing priorities. There's too many people voicing their opinions, and you're like so far off track that you don't really know where you've even started or what your end goal is. A rule of thumb I like to follow is have no more than 3 different people from 3 different departments on your team in this particular scenario. And the reason for that is anything more I found kind of often spirals out of control, even if you do set guidelines and boundaries. So it's kind of important to kind of carry it out in small chunks, treat it as an iterative process. Maybe invite 3 colleagues this time, share your insights and feedback with three other colleagues, 3 different colleagues, see how that's taken, and then rinse and repeat. That's something that I found incredibly useful. That way I'm not kind of getting pulled in different directions and not being able to complete the work that I've intended to do in the first place. All right, this is something that I've really enjoyed doing, which is making your users relatable. Oftentimes you'll find that a lot of the people that I work with kind of think of our users, especially within the financial services space, as someone who, they're kind of very polarizing. They're either, for example, very, very privileged and absolutely everything's fine with them. They're just kind of using our product and service to keep, do a pulse check. On the other end of the spectrum, they cannot live without our product and service. And this is something that they feel like we're God's gift to mankind in terms of what we're delivering. So it's important to actually strike a middle ground and actually tell your colleagues a story and make them feel that they're part of the user's life, so they'll feel a lot more connected to what they're doing as well. If you are conducting research, particularly interviews, you're conducting unmoderated or moderated user tests in particular, if you're able to capture powerful anecdotes, whether you can record it or even if you take notes, for example, if you capture powerful anecdotes from a user's point of view in terms of how this product or service has affected them or hasn't lived up to its expectations, that's something that I found is incredibly useful, especially if you're presenting to other stakeholders. You can put in quotes. You can actually play an audio file, which I've done in the past, which has been very rewarding as people at my company have realized firsthand the impact that they're having on other people's lives. That's really important. Again, this is something that would be helpful if you have access to platforms like user testing or user Zoom, for example, where you can actually create and share highlight reels of user feedback. Try not to work your way into a position where you're the only one relaying feedback to your colleagues, because oftentimes, as I mentioned, things can kind of get lost in translation. People aren't hearing it straight from the horse's mouth, so they're not as likely to be compelled or not as likely to feel moved by a story. So if they're able to witness, I guess, even indirectly what a user's experience is, that's something that can be a powerful motivator. This thing is really important, and I have a cool anecdote to share here is if you can provide visual evidence of a user struggle, that can really turn the tide in your favor. And one of the anecdotes is I was working on this product called Credit Builder, which required, when I first started, initially it required our users to set aside $100 a month just to access it. Now think about $100. That's something for me, that's something I can part with, no problem. But we were asking users to set aside $100 for 6 months and not touch it. And these are users that are actively looking to build their credit, they're struggling. So $100 that we're asking them to set aside is $100 in their mind they're not putting towards putting food on the table or paying off their bills and building credit that way. And earlier on with all the user research and all the interviews we were doing, the one piece of feedback that we got consistently was $100 is too high of a barrier. Like, I cannot do it. If you guys weren't sponsoring my alpha, my participation in the alpha phase, if you guys hadn't ponied up and paid $100, I would not have been able to access this product. But over the course of 5 months, no matter how many times I reiterated this piece of feedback, the product managers and the key execs at our organization just wouldn't listen. They were like, I'm sure they can find ways to, scrounge together $100. Finally, what really turned the tide in my favor was when I was on a customer call and the customer mentioned he was having trouble transferring money between accounts. So I just asked him if he felt comfortable enough to share a screenshot of the current balance in his app so I could figure out what was going on. When he did share the screenshot, it was kind of an eye-opening thing. He was transferring money from his Bank of America account that had $2 in it to his Credit Sesame account that had $3 in it. And he was trying to transfer $1. Those are the balances that he was working with. Capturing that screenshot, putting it in a deck up in front and center, when I presented to execs, I said, listen, these are our target customers. They're struggling, okay? These are the balances we're working with. We cannot expect them to pony up $100. And where is that going to come from? And I could actually see like the light go off and their brains go, oh, okay, now we get it. And that took me about 5 or 6 months to accomplish, but we finally ended up dropping the initial barrier from $100 to right now it is $20 is the minimum. You can go up in increments of 30. But that visual evidence, kind of that shock value, really kind of made people spring into action. And that's something that if you have access to things like that, that's something that I found that's really, really helpful in turning the tide in your favor. A couple of other things you can do is it's not just important to kind of do like a verbal vomit of all your research that you've gathered. Figure out ways to hone your storytelling abilities. What kind of narratives can you craft from your research? How can you bring a person's struggle or bring a person's struggle and trials and tribulations to life in a way that makes people relate to them, in a way that makes people see part of themselves in the user, so they're willing to kind of go the extra mile to serve them. And finally, talked about it earlier in the presentation, but personas, if leveraged correctly, if done correctly, can really bring goals, dreams, and fears to life. So it's important that you actually use them well. A couple of things you'll find when you're dealing with stubborn stakeholders, there's really no way to, make it easy on other people, especially when you have your research that tells one story and you're facing an uphill battle with other stakeholders in your company who have other, key performance indicators and other end goals that they're working towards, and they're always in clash. They're always clashing. So I've listed a few strategies here that you can use to overcome stubborn stakeholders. First thing that's important is get on the same page first. Figure out, and this can be done, I found that this is always useful if done in this case, a Zoom meeting, where it's important that you kind of lay the groundwork and say, okay, let's figure out what your vested interest is. Is there any particular reason why you're facing so much pushback from this particular stakeholder? Why might the person not like your ideas? Is it the way you're presenting them? Is it, the tone in which you're presenting it? Or is it just something completely that you haven't figured out entirely? And how does your recommendation kind of impact their day-to-day operations? Is it adding more work to their already full platter? Or is it something that can be done, but they're not really taking you that seriously? So it's important to kind of get all these questions and have these open and transparent conversations up front. It can be difficult, but it's incredibly rewarding down the line if you're able to have those open conversations. If you're in an environment that's safe and affords you that psychological safety where you can talk to a coworker or talk to a colleague this way, definitely recommend doing that. You'll often find yourself in situations where things will kind of devolve into chaos. But if you are in a position to share your research, or it's at a point where you can use data and examples to kind of see an alternate picture, for example, if you've got a list of recommendations that are just not being followed and you're kind of unable to figure out why, maybe it's the way you're presenting it. Maybe there's ways you can actually turn the tide and say, here's the upside of following my recommendation, and here's the downside of not following it. What are some of the key performance indicators that need to be met? And is there a way to kind of meet in the middle? Figure out maybe we do 25% of a recommendation this time and then pick up the 75% where we left off. the more holistic you make your recommendations and say, hey, here's what'll benefit if we do it, and here's what'll hurt if we don't do it, that's definitely helpful. As I mentioned before, I think it's worth reiterating, define project roles early on, because sometimes if you have a lot of stakeholders at the table, some of them may feel lost, some of them may not know what their worth is or what they're contributing to the table or bringing to the table. So it's important to kind of really define what each person is bringing to the table. Again, don't kind of hang up your hat once you've taught a couple of designers or taught a couple of PMs or anyone else how to do user research, for example. Kind of think of it as like an ongoing mentorship opportunity where you're always educating, always explaining. I tell people, like the designers that I work with, the PMs that I work with, that I kind of have like an open door policy. If they're conducting research on their own and they run into an issue, please come tell me. It'll also kind of open my eyes out to different roadblocks that I may never have encountered, and that will definitely help streamline this entire process across the organization. So being willing to not get tired of, repetitive questions, but always be educating and always be willing to explain why you're doing things a certain way, and be open to feedback as well. And finally, this is something I think is important, to kind of host regular one-on-one catch-up or touch base sessions, particularly with difficult stakeholders. And this can be sometimes tricky to do. Not everyone might want to meet with you and hash things out. But I think it's important to set an agenda and say, here's what we'll cover, but be open and receptive at the same time. Sometimes it might just be down to a personality clash. In my team at Credit Sesame, we were a small team of 3 that first joined. I just so happened that when we were working on this credit builder project, every time I would come up with a recommendation, they would listen to it. But whenever my colleague or my manager came up with their recommendation, they wouldn't. And honestly, it just came down to a personality clash more than anything else. So if you're the chosen one that people listen to, great. Even if you're not, don't feel bad about it. Please empower your colleagues if they are the chosen one, if they're more likely to receive positive feedback. Figure out what about them is, really kind of getting people onto their side, and figure out ways to replicate that. And finally, in terms of defining what success looks like figure out at the end of the day, what is a change you want to see user research bring about? Is it something small? Is it something kind of like, you just want to incorporate that idea into an organization? Or is that something that you want to really set the foundation for and have people kind of run with it as they see fit? It's really important to set an idea of what you would like to see user research achieve in 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, or maybe a timeline when you're no longer there. What is the end goal for that? Think about this as well, is what will success look like if we actually involve UX teams from the start? And this is an exercise that you can kind of go through by yourself, or go through with your tiny team, or go through with a broader workshop. This is definitely something that I will leave up to your judgment, but I found it definitely helps when you have more kind of representative stakeholder from each group at the table answering these questions, because then you get a diverse perspective as well. Think about this during your time here, or even maybe before your time in an organization. What key decisions were made in the past without UX support that may have backfired? How long did it take the team to recover? How long did it take for the team to actually realize there was an issue? And how can that be avoided again? So thinking about this also shows that you're willing to learn from failures, and also willing to take feedback as it goes. And this is something that people can get behind. Failures are expensive, they're costly, they're time consuming. Nobody wants to live through that again. This is a great way of essentially presenting a negative to get people on your side and say, hey, let's avoid that mistake. Here's how I can help if I were brought on early on in the game. Here's something that I do something that works that I do at Credit Sesame is creating prioritization matrix to really channel focus. So it's a simple 4x4 matrix. You can obviously change the axes as you see fit, but things that have worked well for me are if I were to present this in a very visual format. So for example, what are the recommendations that I can present from my research that are, for example, proved to be a high impact to the company and also high impact to the user? And you can play around with the different quadrants as well. And I've often found that the lower right quadrants, the low impact to company, high impact to user, that's something that if you're working with an agile environment or a scrum environment, that's something that can get picked up really fast, is if you're able to show that, hey, this can really transform a user's experience and it's very little work required from our end. Let's actually put all our resources towards doing it. And finally, this is really key, focusing on outcomes. That is what you will do with the insights gained from user research. Sorry about that. Not the outputs of the user research activities really helps people kind of understand what they're getting into. If you focus on, outputs and say, I'm delivering 15 deliverables at the end of every project, no one's going to care. But what are the actual outcomes? What are some of the concrete metrics that you may have changed as a result of your research? What are something that you're looking to change as a result of your research? And focusing on that can really help people feel like, okay, there is some work to be done here, and I'm happy to partner with you on it. So the more you kind of open up your idea, your vision to focusing on outcomes and not outputs, you'll find that really kind of unlocks the door, especially with stubborn stakeholders, but also kind of, helping you get grounded on your own so you can actually see at the end of the day what you've achieved versus what you may not have achieved. So this is another little comic that I put here is, in terms of what user research can do, oftentimes you'll see in the panel here, the first panel person says, we can do user research, design a prototype that meets user needs and improve its usability by usability testing it with users. Not interested. The second panel goes, we can help improve your business bottom line. Now you're talking. So as I mentioned earlier on, capturing key data points and showing how, for example, the upside of taking on a recommendation and the downside of not picking it up, sometimes that's really the name of the game. That's the thing that really tends to work and get people and sway people and get them on your side. And if it's something that isn't working, if it's the only strategy that's working, my advice is take it. It'll help get your foot in the door. It'll help build that credibility that you're looking for initially. And then you can go from there. You really just need one or two kind of great hits and success markers next to your name. And once people really see the value you bring to the table, they're more likely to incorporate you and involve you earlier on in the process. Last thing here before we wrap up is the key takeaways. I know I kind of dumped a lot of information on your plates, but if I had to kind of condense this down into 5 things that I would like everyone to sort of take away from this presentation, it would be, putting the users first, putting them in the comfort zone, giving them the best possible shot to provide concrete feedback. Build a longer table, not a taller wall. So invite people to your table, let them see how you do your job, and trust me, that'll make your life a lot easier in the long run. You're also hopefully taking things off your plate because you're empowering your colleagues to carry out some of the research or some of the work that they might themselves not have had the confidence to do. The third one is document every recommendation. That's really key. Sometimes I feel like a lot of it is kind of just stored up here, or as I mentioned, Slack or Drives or some chat somewhere. But the more organized, the more centralized you keep your repository, the better it is, not just for you and your team, but also for the organization as well that can access it. And if the goal is to create that long-term legacy, you'll want that to kind of live on. So even if you're no longer there, people can still access what you've done. Again, always be willing to educate and explain and be a mentor to your colleagues, be a mentor to your team, but also make it a very cyclical process in that be open to feedback as well. Maybe you're not mentoring them the right way. Maybe they've discovered some way of doing things or a better way of doing things that you couldn't fathom to have done yourself. Be open to feedback as well. So be open to changing your own processes. And finally, focus on outcomes, not outputs. You'll see that once you're focused on results and not just, for example, deliverables, you'll see that people are a lot more willing to kind of embark on this journey that you're kind of dragging them on, and you'll see the tide really beginning to turn in your favor.